After a couple decades of growing my own food, I've made plenty of mistakes that have taught me invaluable lessons and that have shaped my gardening journey. I want to sit here in my garden that is a total mess right now and share my top 5 biggest gardening mistakes with you so I can show you how I'm building on them for future successes and so I can help you to do the same. And trust me, the 5th one is a challenge I'm still facing today. In a little less than 3 weeks, I'm going to be moving and rebuilding my garden from complete scratch for the 3rd time here in South Carolina. And as I plan my new space, I'm thinking about the knowledge I've gained over the years from the times that my garden wasn't doing very well. I'm thinking about how I can grow from the experience of completely letting go my 28 raised bed garden. And if you can relate with having the feeling of completely wanting to just give up, I'll show you why it's so important to just keep on plugging and never quit. When I moved from Michigan to South Carolina 11 years ago, I started my garden and quickly realized the native red clay soil was really tough to work with, so I opted for raised beds. And then after going through the Clemson Master Gardener program to learn everything I could about my new growing zone, I learned about the year-round weeds I'd be facing. I didn't really realize though exactly what I'd be facing until I had actually experienced what seemed like man-eating weeds out here. I spaced my raised beds 3 feet apart and planted Bermuda grass nearby, which turned out to be a big mistake due to its incredibly invasive nature. It will take over everything and it's really difficult to remove. I edged off my garden area and figured out that my thin layer of pine straw mulch that I applied between the beds once per year was ineffective against these aggressive weeds. I was spending way more time dealing with those than I was actually growing food. And this is an instance where I didn't really put 2 and 2 together based on what I learned in my class until I got out there and did it hands-on in person. And then after 5 years, I moved to my current space where my husband at the time and I put raised beds 6 feet apart to accommodate a lawnmower and a small tractor. There's an existing lawn of Bermuda grass, which has been a challenge from the very beginning. But in the beginning, I figured that mowing grass would be less work than dealing with garden paths full of weeds like at my other garden. Put it this way, for my next garden, I'm planning to avoid mowing grass and dealing with invasive weeds altogether by building up the area with natural mulch to smother weeds and enrich the soil, and I'm really excited to show you that process as I do it. I'm so thankful that there isn't any Bermuda grass anywhere near my future garden area. I don't think anyways. When I first started my garden, I had so much fun shopping through seed catalogs, and I picked out so many different varieties of tomatoes and peppers and herbs and all kinds of things. For a lot of gardeners, including myself, this is the most fun part of growing food. It's really hard to hold back excitement going through the beautiful pages of seed catalogs. This is actually a great thing though, because it gets us out here experimenting with different things, and that's how we learn and grow as gardeners. But there's also a fine line between that and wasting money. One of the main reasons why a lot of us grow our own food, including myself as a single parent, is to save money on groceries. After a few years, I realized that a lot of the things I was planting weren't right for my growing zone. For example, I was growing all kinds of heirloom tomatoes that succumbed to disease in our hot and humid climate here. I was growing hardneck garlic that does better in northern climates and long day onions that need more daylight hours to form bulbs. I started to really do more research eventually by carefully reading the descriptions of the seeds I was buying from my favorite organic small companies, and figured out that there are varieties that are bred specifically for certain areas and hybrid varieties that are more disease resistant in certain climates. And this might be an unpopular opinion, but I actually prefer hybrid varieties in some instances, like tomatoes and cucumbers, which are really difficult to grow in my hot and humid microclimate. This means that I can't save the seeds year after year, but I prefer to actually have harvests. I do grow heirloom varieties of some crops like pole beans that do well in my space. So my point is taking the time to really research different crops you'd like to grow and eat, and then finding ones that match your growing space and climate will go a long way and save money and frustration. I've had a lot of failed crops in my garden due to bad timing. Either I would plant things too early or too late, and then sometimes I still do this because I just get so busy with other things in my life that I plant way too late. But part of me still does want to push the envelope and just see what happens. Like last year, I planted zucchini way late towards the end of the summer to test out avoiding squash vine borers. I did end up avoiding them, but I didn't have nearly as big of a harvest later on in the season. I found that planting at the wrong time is way better than not planting at all, but doing a little research does go a long way. Like if you want to have a late fall into winter harvest of carrots, they need to be planted in mid to late summer in order for them to be mature by the time they slow and then stop growth when cold weather and shorter days hit. If they're planted too late, they're going to go dormant before they become mature, so they'll put on a lot of growth in the spring, and that's when the texture becomes tough and the flavor changes. If they're planted just at the right time though, they'll be ready to harvest or overwintered and then sweetened by cold exposure. So knowing when your first frost date is and then counting backwards with the number of days to maturity for your variety will help you calculate the right time to direct sow. Nothing is ever a failure with planting timing because you can keep track of what does well versus what doesn't do well, and then have that invaluable information to empower you for future success. Planting timing definitely lends itself to building healthy soil, and this takes time, experimenting, and planning to figure out in your unique space. It has a lot to do with the length of your growing season, the varieties of crops you're growing, and succession planting. After a few years of growing in the longer growing season here in South Carolina versus Michigan, I started to notice that I was planting earlier in the year than I was used to as it warms up earlier in the spring here. A lot of those crops were done well before the growing season was, leaving the soil bare. Or I would succession plant, and then when fall approached, everything would be done and the soil would be bare. I'd just leave it until the following spring, but the winter annual weeds would take over, and then the early spring weeds would take over, and I ended up spending a ton of time pulling weeds before I could plant anything in the spring, and then at the same time disturbing the soil, which would just make more weeds grow. It was a vicious cycle and a lot of work. So I started researching and watching the methods of experienced gardeners close to my area, and I learned about low-till or no-till methods and also cover crops. I really like to watch gardeners whose methods are proven by seeing their failures and successful harvests, and then I go from there and do more research via reliable sources like university extension offices and my favorite small business seed companies' blogs. I took this info and experimented with it in my own garden and figured out that planting fall cover crops played a huge role in reducing weeds and controlling erosion, building healthy soil, and even reducing pest pressures. I saw pretty immediate results the season after planting them the first time, and I swore I'd never leave my soil bare again. And if I'm unable to plant cover crops in the fall, I apply a thick layer of natural mulch over the soil. Leaf litter is a great option because it decomposes into the soil fairly quickly, but it provides a great barrier over the soil in the winter. My advice would be to experiment with what you have on hand and with your unique space and microclimate to make sure your soil is never bare. And now here's the biggest mistake I feel like I've made growing my own food, and it's led to overwhelm and burnout, time management issues, maintenance challenges, and stress and frustration. It's something that you can see I'm struggling with right now. Part of the reason why my garden is a total mess right now is that the house has been up for sale and now it's sold, and I know the new buyers aren't going to keep the garden bed, so I haven't put forth the effort other than just keeping the grass mowed and tidy. But this 28 raised bed garden has been going downhill for the past couple of years. I've been going through a divorce situation, and there's no way that I could have kept this garden going the way that it was meant to. So letting go of the dreams and goals has affected me a lot, and I've felt like giving up numerous times. I was really struggling to scale back because I had invested in a large garden and I was feeling like I'd wasted my time and my resources. But based on the few things I've planted this year and the few volunteer plants the garden has produced, I've focused on celebrating those things and using that energy to create a smaller and more manageable garden space behind this one made of raised beds that I could move to my new location and rebuild my goals and dreams on a much smaller scale. I bit off more than I could chew when starting that big 28 raised bed garden. I planned it with a partnership that eventually dissolved, and then I couldn't manage it on my own. Not to say you can't manage a garden of that size on your own, but my advice is to start building from a small scale, starting with a few favorite things that you like to eat that are hardy and easy to grow in your area. From there, you'll find that you can grow a fairly large amount of food in a small space. What I'm taking away from this large garden right here is that I've learned a lot from it through both successes and failures, and I've learned to shift my energy from wanting to completely give up when it got to be too much towards rebuilding to a more manageable scale. Growing food on a larger scale is definitely doable in the home garden, but it needs to be carefully planned out from year to year, and even considering a scaling down plan, because it might eventually come to that. Gardening is a continuous learning process, and even seasoned gardeners face challenges. Remember that every mistake is an opportunity to grow and improve, and whether it's reconsidering the space between raised beds, selecting the right plant varieties, perfecting your timing, keeping soil covered, or managing the scale of your garden, there's always something new to learn and adapt. As I prepare to rebuild my garden from scratch once again, I hope these insights are going to help you avoid some of the pitfalls I've encountered. Stay tuned for more videos where I'm going to share my progress and more tips to help you succeed in your gardening journey. Let's keep growing together, and remember, never give up, no matter how tough it gets. And if you'd enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with fellow gardeners. Thank you for joining me out here in my garden.